I'm going to answer a couple of questions about cover stitching, fold over, elastic and binders. You probably got a bracket for binders with your industrial cover stitch, which is like an adapter plate for domestic ones. The bracket comes with screws and washers, which you need to attach to the right side of the front as you look at the machine. I prefer to attach the binder to the bracket as it's more fiddly, and then put the bracket on the screws and tighten the screws. As I've made more binders videos for domestic cover stitch machines, this one is on my industrial Juki MF7923. So the first question, can you use fold over elastic with binders? Yes, of course you can. I don't have small size binders, so to answer another of your questions, do you need a special binder for each type of binding? My answer is no, though it helps. My binder's output here is 36 millimeters and it's a double fold one. But just by guiding the double fold elastic, I can easily attach it without the need to buy a separate single fold, smaller size binders. The binder I'm using here is from Erika Siskrin. I'm going to put the link to her shop below, and it can be used with a domestic cover stitch machine, and it has been used with my domestic cover stitches, as you might have seen in my videos. The fiddly bit is done, so now I can put my bracket with the binder already attached on the screws that I had already put onto my machine, and I'm going to screw them tighter. As always, as with any other binding, the position of the binder is vital, so you might want to try it a few times to find the optimal position. The fold over elastic goes in the middle of the binder so that it's precisely between the folds or lips of the binder. I'm going to put it through the rake. Let me just adjust my camera so that you can see that. So I'm using the rake, and you can see how big my binder is and how small the elastic is. So first through the rake, then into the binder, and I'm making sure, sorry, I did it wrong. I have to change it because it's the shiny side that should be to the outside. The shiny side of the elastic should go to the outside, the pretty side to the outside. It is just a sample, so it doesn't really matter here, but the shiny side should go to the outside, the matte side towards you, facing you. And place the elastic so that the middle of the fold over elastic is precisely between the lips or the folds of the binder. And the only difference here is going to be that I'm going to use my right hand to guide the elastic slightly to find the right position. If you have a smaller binder, obviously you wouldn't have to do that, so it's more comfortable, but you don't have to buy a special binder. I don't think you have to buy a special binder. I'm going to use 2 needles because I can't use 3 on this machine. My gauge is 6.4, so it's actually easier to do it on a domestic cover stitch. I'm also using contrasting thread to make the stitches more visible. On an actual garment I wouldn't, though it's up to you. I have size 80 needles, equivalent of domestic SUK. My looper tension, as always, is quite loose. I want to achieve so-called balloon stitch to make sure my thread doesn't break when it stretches. It's especially important if you're not using woolly nylon maxi-lock stretch thread. You might need to increase the foot presser pressure for some thicker elastic fabric combo, not much. Okay, so another question was, can you use 3 needles cover stitch with fold over elastic in your binder? Well, yes and no. Yes, if your gauge is 5.4 or smaller, so I can't, unless I want one line of stitches under the elastic, and I'm going to show you that. I'm going to show you how it looks like, but I don't use it in my sewing. So again, the elastic is in the middle, and I'm going to use my right hand to guide the elastic because I don't have the right size of the binder. But other than that, everything is as always with the binding. So the fabric goes in the middle between the lips of the binder, and the fabric must touch the binding or the elastic at all times. It's very important because if you have gaps, it's not going to be perfect. The position of the binder is vital. And you will find that you have to adjust the position of the binder a few times to find your perfect spot. So it looks like that. The balloon stitch again at the back to create the stretch. Textured nylon or textured filament thread, also known as woolly nylon, would provide much better coverage, but I'm just using 120S polyester thread here. And this is the only way it could look like on my machine because of the gauge. So one needle is off the binding. And to answer another question, I'm going to change and I'm going to use normal binding, 36 millimeters or 3.6 centimeters wide binding in this binder, because you were asking why sometimes binding doesn't really stretch much. I'm assuming that you know that we need to use stretchy binding, so binding cut from stretchy fabric. The fabric must be at least as stretchy as the main fabric, the fabric on the garment. And because in general, when we use binders, we ease the main fabric in the binding or in the elastic, I like to slightly stretch the elastic or the binding. It's not even stretching as such, it's more of making sure the binding or the elastic is taut. Again, the balloon stitch formed by the looper is meant to help with the stretch and recovery of this segment of your garment. Remember that in any cover stitch, it's best to work with the lowest tension that brings you the desired results. The same rules apply to domestic cover stitches. There is in fact very little in domestic cover stitches that is different. And the fundamentals are the same. And my sample looks like that. And of course you wouldn't use white thread with black binding in your garment, but it stretches, it's taut enough, the binding was taut enough to provide the pulling or recovery effect. Another question about binder was, can I use a generic binder? Yes, you can, but they are not the best. I have a 14 millimeters generic binder sold on eBay for about £15. It's made in China, it's usable, but it always needs far more adjustments. I've been using it with my domestic Juki and marked the best position for the screws. This is not the best position for this machine, but I don't really like this binder much. So to sum up, you can use it, but I wouldn't recommend it. The ones sold for your particular machine, domestic or industrial, are going to work best. Of course, as you could see, I use Erica screen binder that is also generic, but it's of such an exceptional quality that I would struggle to find anything better. And as I'm fiddling with my binder, I'm going to answer another question. This one was about the stitch length. I actually use longish stitch for binding, between 3 and 4, and I have not noticed any benefits in shortening it. The stitch length depends more on what fabric you use. Longer for thick fabric, shorter for thin fabric. The looper and the feed dogs are more responsible for the stretch of your stitches. It's easier to understand when you either set your differential feed to 2 or simply stretch your binding and stitch with longer stitch lengths. The stitch is going to be shortened by the feed dog's work, and when you compare it with a sample with differential on 0 or without stretching the binding, the length is going to appear different. And although it's true, the shorter stitch is stronger, if you use it on thick fabric, it will cause more shredding, or to put it simply, your thick needle is going to make more holes. The seam is going to be weaker, not stronger. So as always, use common sense, whatever you do, and make a test first. Also, don't forget to like this video. As you can see, the positioning of my generic binder takes much longer than my other generic binder of a better quality, or any binder that is provided with your machine. This is not the best binder in the world. I'm going to pull my binding to show you that the stitch is going to be slightly shorter, despite the fact that I haven't changed the stitch length. So it's about 3.5 here. And it's just a quick sample. I'm using viscose jersey as my binding and cotton jersey as my main fabric. And it looks like that. So see, the stitches look a bit smaller than they really are because I was pulling the binding a bit more. It's the same thing as if you set the differential a bit higher. Hopefully that answers your questions.